Hi, everyone. My name is Trio. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs. I am a restorative justice facilitator and human trafficking student prevention lead at McClymonds High School in West Oakland, California for Oakland Unified School District. This is my course presentation for the evaluation of research class. So I will get started. So for my topic, I talked about the intersections of restorative practices and intimate partner violence and how restorative practices can be used in incidents of intimate partner violence. So specifically, my question is, how does using restorative practices as an intervention tool for people impacted by intimate partner violence better serve the needs of people who have been harmed by intimate partner violence when compared to traditional police or state intervention? So for my research, my keywords, or for the class at least, my keywords included intimate partner violence, victim impact panels, mandated treatment programs, therapeutic ritual environments, as well as gender violence. So the articles that I evaluated at a qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods design level involved either all of these things or aspects of these things. So what I'm going to look at first is my qualitative research article, which was about ritual as a treatment for those who have perpetuated domestic violence. So the hypothesis of this article was that unmet childhood trauma that manifests into a flight-oriented response, survival response when presented with conflict, is why people basically are involved in intimate partner violence. The reason why you committed an act of violence is because there was unmet childhood trauma. So when I first heard that hypothesis, I was a little bit hesitant. It sounded as if it was pathologizing people with histories of trauma. And when the research article actually got to its conclusion, what the researcher found was that it was actually a fear of abandonment that perpetrators of intimate partner violence expressed as one of the major reasons. It wasn't necessarily unmet childhood trauma, it was the fear of abandonment in a current relationship. So for this research survey, the data collection involved questionnaires, interviews, and memory prompts that were more open-ended. So how are you affected? Is there anything else you want to tell me about that? So that the script, the memory prompt, and the guided questions would really be all the guiding that there was for participants. Outside of that, once the question was asked, how are you affected, was the way that the participants were guided by the researcher to allow them to give their own responses. And literature review was based on court reports and mandated treatment programs for domestic violence. So it was something that was reliable and it was something that was credible. Looking at the quantitative research article, I was looking at the impact of victim impact panels on perpetrators of intimate partner violence. So the hypothesis here is that the use of restorative justice interventions on victim impact panels can increase perpetrators' empathy for their victims. While the author did clarify the differences between a detached empathetic response versus a more empathetic connection, it's difficult to measure empathy, especially when it's not clearly defined. So that was a moment that was a little bit of an uh-oh, because I didn't feel it was fair to just assess how empathetic someone is without really defining it first. Even though there are differences in what detached empathetic responses look like, it still didn't do enough for me. And the literature review did acknowledge the reluctance towards using restorative justice models in the intimate partner violence practice community, which has actually been something that I found to be true in my own experiences as well. So challenges and fears. One thing I noticed was that I was afraid of the lack of attention to implications for same-sex relationships experiencing intimate partner violence. Sometimes what happens is in relationships where people are of the same gender is that the partner who's seen as more masculine is seen as the aggressor, when that's not always the case. And I've seen that time and again with adults and young people in relationships where they're dating a partner of the same sex. What I also had some challenges and fears around was that rates of recidivism were not used in the study. So somebody could have been returned or returning to prison or incarceration for intimate partner violence, but we wouldn't know if it was their first or second or third conviction. That wasn't a part of the data. Criminal history was, but recidivism was not a part of that data. So the studies took place in local counties. That means that we lack a larger scale of application. We're not able to see how this study could look on a federal level because states and federal laws around domestic violence are different. Sample bias was not assessed to see how respondents in a mandated treatment program might alter their answers. So in the research studies, when doing work around people who had either harmed others or those who had been harmed, one thing that was not addressed was how someone who's supposed to be mandated in this program might adjust their answers or responses. So that affects the research, and that part was something that the researchers addressed in the end of their conclusion, but not within the actual data itself. And then I also had some fears, as I mentioned before, around how to measure empathy and how is it fair to assess empathy in others. So that was a concern for me, especially if empathy is not being defined. When it comes to improving the field, one question I had was, how do partners of participants, so those who have harmed others, view any impact in their lived experience after the victim impact panels? What changes do we see? And that's one thing that the researchers offered that they did not further explore, that I also did not see further explored in research that continued on from the conversation that I was studying. So one of my research articles, my quantitative article, was carried on in the mixed methods design. They mentioned the author that I read about, but they didn't really continue on and do that work of answering that question. Another concern that I would have for improving the field is measuring how offender classification and recidivism rates, like I said before, they impact the levels of empathy, and they impact how people show up, how they respond, what responses they give, how committed they are to showing up in the process of repairing harm. And then also focusing on different demographic characteristics like offender classification or levels of custody, min, max, or more restrictive environments. What kind of environments are these incarcerated people in? We don't talk about that typically in these studies as well, because they're not seen as relevant. But to me, that is relevant in the work that we're doing. If you're in a mandated treatment program and you're in a higher level of custody, maybe you might want to show up more for that program. And then as far as improving my work, I really want to think about making connections between people in different states where laws on intimate partner violence differ. I am in California, but I work with national organizations around many issues, including intimate partner violence, but also restorative and transformative justice and where the two intersect. And so due to state laws being so different, it can be hard sometimes to find these networks of solidarity, of interconnection, of interdependence, because of people's needs being so different based on the legal system. One thing I need to work on in improving my own work is recognizing that RJ does not need to be used in every scenario because RJ is voluntary. And that's where a large amount of resistance comes from intimate partner violence communities, is that restorative practices wants people to come together, all parties, all people who have been involved and harmed, and be able to have a conversation. Well, an incidence of really moderate to severe or even egregious sexual harm or sexual violence that can happen to another person, folks are not always going to be willing or wanting to be in a conversation with someone else. Even the idea of holding that person accountable or responsible for their behavior can be really upsetting. And then remembering for myself not to gender violence or people who may cause harm via intimate partner violence. So a lot of the time when I was doing this research, what I saw is that we were gendering violence as male. And I don't want to assume that the most amount of people in this world who are involved in perpetuating intimate partner violence are men, when what I've noticed is that in relationships, there can be times, regardless of whether it's same sex or not, there can be times where both partners may have been involved in some kind of violence or violent behavior. Whether or not it would be labeled as intimate partner violence, well, we can see that in any relationship that there's always time and place for harm to happen, and anyone can harm anyone. So I wanted to remember that in my work. And then my final takeaway was, while there is resistance to restorative justice models in the intimate partner violence practice community, that resistance exists again because people expect restorative justice to kind of force people in a room, when that's not what it's about. Restorative justice and restorative practices can only successfully work, especially in intimate partner violence communities or any kind of moderate to severe crisis prevention intervention community, when everyone who has been harmed volunteer actively to show up and be a part of that process. And so for me, one thing I learned in the evaluation of research was that restorative research, it can dig deeper into making meaningful connections for these communities to actually intersect restorative practices and intimate partner violence practice communities through either victim impact panels, through either the idea of ritual as therapy, through the idea of being able to bring people together who have harmed others to listen to the stories of those who have been harmed. So I wanted to really thank you all for your time. Thank you all for the course. And that is my presentation. I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day.